Some stories don't begin with thunder or gunfire. They begin with silence. A silence so heavy, so deliberate, that it feels like the land itself is holding its breath. That's how it was in Maplewood, a fading American town tucked between rolling hills and forgotten farmland. People there like to say everyone had secrets, but in truth, most of them weren't worth whispering about. Most, except one. The Ellison family had always been a name people spoke with both respect and unease. Their farm was the oldest in Maplewood, the land stretching across fields that carried more history than anyone dared ask about. And at the heart of it stood a barn, a weathered, time-worn structure that looked like any other to an outsider, but to those who belonged to the family, it was more than wood and nails. It was memory. It was power. It was silence made solid. On one late autumn morning, the golden sun burned to the mist and lit up that barn like a stage set for something waiting to unfold. Standing before it was Nora Ellison, a woman whose beauty had always been more of a curse than a blessing. She had the kind of face people remembered, the kind that made neighbors smile politely to her face, but tear her apart in hushed conversations behind her back. Nora had married Jonathan Ellison, the youngest heir to the farm. Jonathan was steady, reliable, and so quiet that sometimes even Nora felt like she was married to a ghost. He loved her, of that she was certain, but his love was a kind of safe love, warm, dependable, yet without fire. And fire was what Nora craved. Perhaps that's why she found herself drifting into conversations with Franklin Ellison, Jonathan's grandfather and the patriarch of the family. Franklin was everything Jonathan wasn't. Charismatic in a rough, dangerous way. Sharp-eyed, with a sly humor that could charm or cut depending on how he chose to use it. To the town, Franklin was a man to be respected, a widower, a survivor, a man who had raised his grandson after tragedy stole Jonathan's parents. But behind his measured silence lived something else, something untamed. Nora felt it every time he looked at her. There was a weight in his gaze, not unkind but unsettling, as though he saw through her polished smile and straight into hunger she tried to hide. And when Jonathan was away in town, which was often, Nora sometimes found herself alone with Franklin in that old barn, learning about the history of the tools he guarded, as if they were sacred relics. He called it his armory. Rows of axes, saws, knives, and hammers hung on the walls, each polished and kept with a care that bordered on reverence. Franklin loved telling stories about them, where each one came from, what it had been used for. Some of his tales were almost amusing, others laced with strange, darker pride. One afternoon, when the air smelled of cut hay and rain-soaked earth, Franklin locked the barn door behind him. The sound of the bolt sliding into place made Nora's chest tighten. He didn't explain why. He just gave her a look, a knowing look, and then turned back to the tools on the wall. "Funny thing about tools," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "They tell the truth. You hold one long enough, it shows you exactly who you are." Nora tried to laugh, though the sound caught in her throat. The way his eyes lingered on her made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was only nerves, but deep down she knew it was something else, an unspoken current passing between them, dangerous and magnetic. When Franklin picked up an old hunting knife, tracing its handle with his calloused fingers, Nora found herself unable to look away. There was something mesmerizing about the way he held it, as if it wasn't just steel and wood, but an extension of his very will. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the barn felt like the only place in the world. She told herself she should leave, but she didn't move. She told herself she should break the silence. But the truth was she wanted to know what he would say next. That's how it always was with Franklin. Every word, every pause, carried the weight of something forbidden. The townsfolk noticed the closeness. Whispers spread quickly in Maplewood, as whispers always do. They said Nora was too bold, too curious, too drawn to the shadow where light dared not shine. They said Jonathan was too blind, too soft, too trusting. And they said Franklin, well, Franklin had always had a dangerous streak. Still, Nora returned to the barn, again and again. Each time, she told herself it was harmless, that it was only stories, only tools, only history. But deep down, she felt the pull. It wasn't love, not exactly, but it was something just as powerful, a mixture of fear and longing, The kind of tension that makes a heart race and a conscience ache. Until one morning, Nora disappeared. Jonathan awoke to an empty bed, but thought little of it. She often walked the fields at dawn, her shawl trailing behind her like a ghost in the fog. But by noon, when she still hadn't returned, a quiet unease began to crawl through him. He told himself she was fine. He told himself not to worry. But then Franklin's voice called from the barn, low, heavy, with something in it Jonathan had never heard before. "Come here, boy." Jonathan's steps were unsteady as he crossed the field, dread gathering with every pace. When he entered the barn, the air felt colder. Franklin stood at the workbench, his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles were pale. On the floor behind him lay Nora. For a fleeting second, Jonathan thought she was sleeping. But the stillness, the wrongness of her body told him otherwise. The truth hit him like a storm, knocking the breath from his lungs. His wife, the woman whose laughter once filled their small house, was gone. And Franklin, the man who had raised him, the man he trusted more than anyone, simply stared. His expression was unreadable, haunted perhaps, but hardened too. When he finally spoke, his words were colder than steel. "She was nothing but trouble," he muttered. "Pretty face, empty heart, brought it on herself." Jonathan's chest heaved, torn between grief and fury. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words refused to come. He could only stare, the hollow pounding of his heart drowning out reason. And when Franklin's eyes met his, there was no trace of warmth left. "Sometimes," Franklin said softly, almost like a confession, "you have to cut away the weak branches if you want the tree to survive." Something inside Jonathan shattered. For the first time, he saw Franklin not as a man who raised him, but as something darker, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. The days that followed were a blur. Neighbors whispered. The sheriff asked questions, but no one dared challenge the Ellisons. The funeral was small, the sky gray and heavy. Jonathan stood like a ghost beside the grave, numb, hollow, while Franklin's shadow loomed beside him. But Jonathan wasn't alone in his suspicion. His cousin, Daniel, had always distrusted Franklin, had always sensed the rot behind the family pride. After the funeral, Daniel pulled Jonathan aside, voice low, eyes sharp. "You know what happened," he said. "You just don't want to admit it, and this isn't the first time." He told Jonathan about Elise Rowan, a woman from years ago who had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. A woman Franklin had been close to, too close. Jonathan's blood ran cold. And so the two cousins began to dig, not just through old rumors, but through the very land Franklin had built his legacy upon. Until one night, they uncovered something buried deep in the earth. A box. Inside it, letters, photographs, and a ring that once belonged to Nora. Jonathan's hands trembled as he held it. The final proof that the man he trusted most was hiding something far darker than he ever dared imagine. And in that moment, Jonathan knew. His grandfather wasn't just guarding tools. He was guarding secrets. Secrets that could tear the Ellison family apart forever. The question was no longer whether Franklin was guilty. It was whether Jonathan had the strength to finally confront him, and whether he could survive the truth once it was fully unearthed.